So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview, broadcast and recorded live on blogtalkradio.com from the new media and baseball capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. I like to think of myself as one of those guys with ink in his veins. At 13, I concluded that the New Brunswick Home News, my hometown paper in New Jersey, was inadequate, so I used my own money to subscribe to the Newark Star-Ledger. At 14, I sold my first freelance story to a hobbyist newspaper in Indiana, the Tri-State Trader. At 22, just out of college, I began stringing newspaper stories to the St. Petersburg Times. At 26, I had a short-lived stint as pop music critic for the Tampa Tribune. And at 27, I was the editor of the alternative paper, Tampa Bay Weekly, for a year. Today, I'm married to a newspaper editor. Now, all that said, I've been predicting the death of the print edition of newspapers for at least 10 years. But not the death of newspapers themselves. I firmly believe that the content will outlast all of us. It's just in search of a new delivery system. And that brings me to today's guest, Paul Gillin, the man behind the popular blog newspaperdeathwatch.com. Yes, it makes me laugh just to say it. He's also the author of the book, The New Influencers. Paul, welcome to Mr. Media.
Hi, Bob. Pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you on. I think this is a very topical subject, and I have a feeling we'll have some fun with it. Also, before we even get started, I want to give out our phone number because I suspect we'll hear from some folks who may have some either opinions agreeing with you on the death of newspapers or maybe disagreeing. So if you want to get on the lines now, 1-646-595-3135. We'll keep an eye on the switchboard and get you in as quickly as we can. So, Paul, how close are we to the death of a major newspaper?
I think we're months away, Bob. In fact, there are the Newark Star-Ledger announced that it was going to cease publishing on paper in January if it didn't get concessions from its unions, which it did get. The Rocky Mountain News in Denver is for sale, and the publisher has announced that it will be shut down if a buyer isn't found by January. The two papers in Detroit are both scaling back their print frequency, and I think certainly during 2009 we're going to see major Metropolitan Daily shut down their print editions, and I think we'll see it early in the year.
Well, couldn't you be more specific?
Those are just two, by the way. The Miami Herald is also for sale. No bidders on that are known. There are, by one count, I think the Financial Times said last week that some 30 newspapers are for sale in the United States right now, and nobody's buying them.
Well, I mean, you're giving them a bad name. Come on now. Maybe if you stopped blogging about this, it would go away.
Well, ironically, the title of my blog, Newspaper Death Watch, was it was a wonderful domain, so I was pleased to be able to get it. But the real purpose of the blog is to document the changes going on in the industry, but it's also about the reinvention of journalism. And I think that what will emerge out of this nasty phase, this death spiral that the print editions are going through, is there will be a new kind of journalism, a new model that will emerge online that I think will be very, very positive. It's just that the old model, the print model, is not sustainable anymore.
Well, and that's really what the first thing I really wanted to ask you was, how would you define death for a newspaper? For example, is the Christian Science Monitor dead because it gave up the print edition or is giving up the print edition for the web?
Well, the brand certainly, I think, will exist for a long time. It's possible. In fact, newspapers, for many of them, the most valuable asset they have is their brand. The business, the assets, the structure that it takes to deliver on paper is actually a liability. So what I think will happen is that the brands that people trust, and brands are more important than ever online, the brands will continue to persist. And we will have the Dallas Morning News and the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune. I think those brands will be with us 50 years from now. But we have to go through this painful deconstruction process to get there, because the business model that is in place to deliver the product on paper is not sustainable anymore. It's outmoded. It can't last.
Would this be a good time for somebody with a few dollars in their pocket in an entrepreneurial sense to start a new news distribution product? That didn't rely on print and the physical distribution of trucks and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, many of them are being started right now. There's one great example is an entity called Politico out of Capitol Hill that publishes in print on a very occasional schedule, but also has a television arm and a web arm, and is actually growing like crazy. They just joined forces with Reuters to create an alternative to the Associated Press, and they're enjoying great success, and it's profitable. And there are many organizations like that. There's ProPublica, which is being run by Paul Steiger, the former managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, and many smaller organizations that are popping up. Talking Points Memo is a successful website that actually won a George Polk Award this year, a very prestigious award for its investigative journalism. We are seeing these operations pop up all over the place. They require much less money to start. The investment is small. The staffs are usually small. They're very, very focused, and several of them are having outstanding success.
Are there any print operations, newspaper print operations that are being smart and are being successful in transferring to a strictly online or mostly online operation? Is there anyone out there that is a shining model to the rest of the industry?
Well, I think the Christian Science Monitor deserves a lot of credit for being the first to really take the plunge and say we're going to all but exit the print business. Of course, the Monitor has a very different business model because they're subsidized by the Christian Science Church. It's not a profitable entity. So it's not really an example to the rest of the industry. I like what's being done at the Dallas Morning News right now, where they've got a series of regional neighborhood editions that are made up almost entirely of consumer-generated content that is then published in a print edition. I think that the national dailies, such as New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and USA Today, were smart to go national when they did, and that if any papers survive in print, 10, 15 years hence, it will probably be them. But I don't really see anybody doing anything remarkable right now because you can't. It's too late. The industry cannot rescue the print edition, so all of these newspapers have to go through this very painful downsizing in order to get to some sort of sustainable model, which will probably be a hybrid print-online model, but with a much smaller print presence.
Are the Detroit papers, which recently announced that I think they're only going to do delivery, on Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, or Thursday, Friday, and Sunday, something
Thursday,
like
Friday,
that.
and Sunday, yeah, which are the three most
Thursday,
profitable days in the newspaper business.
Are they just postponing the inevitable? I mean, if they're in that kind of shape now, is it just inevitable that they're going to give up print?
Well, I think there were some elements of brilliance in the strategy, and just to recap for your listeners, what the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press are doing is they're actually going to continue to publish 7 days a week, but 4 of those days will be a very small 32-page digest, essentially, that will be distributed strictly by newsstand. There will be no home delivery. And then on Thursday, Friday, and Sunday, which, as I said, are the most profitable days, there will be they continue to publish the paper that they're publishing now and move more of their resources online. They're doing this, they say, without laying off any editors, which is remarkable. And so they're trying to make this transition to an online model by reducing their print frequency and sort of easing themselves into it that way. Now, I think there are elements of brilliance in there. The reduced frequency, I think, is a good idea. I think they're leading the industry in that area. I don't know why they're continuing to publish in print the 4 days of the week that are that nobody buys newspapers. It doesn't make any sense to me. I also think that the likelihood they'll be able to sustain the size of the editorial staff they have with a much lower revenue base is not going to last very long. But there are some clever things in that plan. I think that they had no choice. It's a desperate move. Detroit is about as bad as it gets economically in a major U.S. city right now, and I don't really think they have much choice.
Seems like it'd be a tough time to be in Detroit. You've got the newspapers going I don't want to say they're going down, but they're definitely hurting. You've got the auto industry hurting very badly. I don't think anyone would have guessed that a year ago that the auto industry and the newspaper industry would be fighting each other for who was going to be a dinosaur first.
And really, in Detroit, unfortunately, they're in a deadly embrace because one is so dependent on the other, and no segment of the advertising industry has been hit harder in the last year than the automotive segment. So it's a perfect storm in Detroit, and it's very sad.
I want to give out our phone number again. I know what tends to happen, and we'll be talking for a while here, but what tends to happen is people wait until near the end to ask their questions. I know we've got people out there listening, so give us a call, 646-595-3135. Talk to Paul Gillin. He's the man behind the newspaper deathwatch.com blog. And if you haven't been there yet, go to the site, www.newspaperdeathwatch.com. It'll bring you up to date on, the death of newspapers. Paul, we should kind of establish here early on where your expertise comes for writing about this. You've got some ink in your veins too, I believe.
Well, I've been in publishing for about 27 years now. So that, and much of that was in print publishing. The first 17 years of that was in print publishing, not for a daily newspaper. Interestingly, I ended up in the technology media early on, so publishing in the weekly technology media, but always with a special interest in newspapers, and written freelance for newspapers, and always been close to that industry. But I was an editor, was editor-in-chief of Computer World for several years, and really ink in the veins, I think, is a good description. I have a lot of experience in publishing ink on dead trees, as a former boss of mine used to say. About 1999, I made the jump to an internet company. I've spent the last 9 years immersed in the web, really doing very little print work at all. So made that transition, I guess, early, and have been able to watch somewhat dispassionately as my old industry has suffered.
What caused you to start the blog? How long ago did it start, and what prompted you to start?
It's an interesting question. As I mentioned, I was in technology for many years, and one of the things that you see in the information technology industry is, I think is almost unique to that industry, is the sort of ritual destruction of markets on a regular basis. About every 10 years in the IT market, there's a complete turning over of industry leadership. And usually that's caused by a small disruption in technology. The internet was a disruption. The personal computer was a disruption. Networks were a disruption. And every time a new disruptive force comes along, usually the established players cannot adapt to it, and so they die. And living in New England, as I do, seeing companies, once great companies like Digital Equipment, like Wang Laboratories, like Data General, essentially blow up in the course of just 2 or 3 years. It's fascinating to watch this cycle repeat again and again. There's a book called The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen that documents this brilliantly. And so I was always fascinated by the impact that small technology changes would have, the ripple effect that they have on industries down the road. About 3 years ago, I saw this happening in the newspaper industry. A very big fan of newspapers for many years, devoted reader of newspapers, and what I saw was that the internet was going to fundamentally disrupt that model, and it was going to cause newspapers to crash very, very quickly. I had seen this happen again in technology again and again, and I could see the exact same sequence playing out in newspapers. So I wrote an essay in mid-1986 to that effect, which has gotten pretty good distribution around the internet, and decided in the spring of 2007 that I would start documenting this on a blog, and that's when I started Newspaper Death Watch, which has been a labor of love of mine, but is in many ways the most gets more of my hours than almost any other project I work on.
Yeah, I know how that is. One of the reasons I've put so much energy into Mr. Media is that I've made my living as a freelance writer and an author of books the last 10 or 15, 20 years. It's been a while. And my print opportunities are disappearing, and I just thought it was time to come up with something, in a multimedia maybe I wouldn't have to worry about whether the next magazine or newspaper was going to be there and call me next week. And I think that was on the right track.
And it's really remarkable how much the impact of these conventional media is diminished. I've written a couple of books recently. One of them came out last year. It came out in April of 2007. Got a favorable review in the print edition of the Wall Street Journal in July, and when I saw that, I thought this is the big time. This is exactly what we need. Well, in fact, the impact on sales was minimal. For about 2 weeks, sales perked up, and then they dropped back down again. What really made the book a success was bloggers. It was over 100 blogger reviews, and every time another blogger review would pop up, sales would reach a different plateau. And I became a believer that lots of small voices collectively are more powerful than one big voice. And I hear this anecdotally again and again in the industry, that the article in the Wall Street Journal just doesn't make that much of a difference anymore. It's getting on TechCrunch, it's getting on Gawker, it's getting on Mr. Media, that really makes the difference, because those are the credible brands now.
Can I quote that? I want to put that all over my press. Getting on Mr. Media is crazy.
I don't mean to say, by the way, the Wall Street Journal is not a credible brand. That's.
Oh, come on! Now you're killing me. I was so excited there.
But when you look at what look at what TechCrunch has done in just the last 2 years. The site was practically unknown 2 years ago, and now has probably got about as much throw weight in the valley as the San Jose Mercury News. Amazing the speed at which these new voices are coming online and really moving markets. And in the meantime, the average age of a daily newspaper reader, according to Carnegie Report, this is 3 years ago, was 55 years old. The average age of a network evening news viewer is 61. You can see where this trend is going. In 10 years, as one columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times said last year, newspapers aren't dying, our readers are.
Yeah, I was going to say the average age of readers or viewers for the nightly news will be dead.
Dan Rather predicted this year that I'm paraphrasing him, and I'm not sure I got it exactly right, but he said to the effect of, one of these network evening news programs is going to go away within the next year or two.
Sorry, Katie.
So we're really seeing it's remarkable. The ritual demolition of an industry. When I wrote the essay in 2006, I predicted that there'd be 5 newspapers left in the United States by 2025. I now think that prediction was optimistic. I think that we may be looking at 2015. There may be 5 left. The rate of decline is so fast that it's breathtaking how fast it is.
Paul, and I just want to clarify. Print newspapers. I mean, you're not anticipating that all of these the brand themselves will go away, or
yeah. I mean, newspaper sort of implies print, right? Because there's a paper in the word. I suppose that the Boston Globe doesn't say paper in it anywhere, so the Boston Globe, I'm sure, will persist as a brand for a long time. They're in the process of trying to move to an online brand. But no, what I mean is that the printed edition of the newspaper landing on your front doorstep, that's what's going to be going away. But I think the brands will last.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah.
No, it's important. There are some activity. There's some startup activity. There's a chain of newspapers called the Metro that actually comes out of Europe that has over 100 free dailies around the world that's having some success. It's not blistering success. They're having, they're struggling, but it's been a growth story in newspapers. There are overseas in many third world countries now, newspapers are actually a booming business. They're growing like crazy in India right now. So there are, in developing countries, there is a healthy press. But in this country, in the United States, of course, there's what we see as the internet coming online. Research from Gallup released just last week showed that the percentage of Americans who get their news, who read online daily for news, increased from 30% to 41% in just the last 6 years, while the percentage who read a daily newspaper predominantly for their news is declined from from I think 60 to 44%. Those two, no, I think it's 50% actually. Those two lines are going to cross very soon. And when they cross is when you reach the tipping point. Well, what we're seeing now in the newspaper business, in the newspaper conglomerates, the companies that publish them, the spiral is actually getting deeper. So the last 6 quarters in a row, newspaper profits have declined at a faster rate each quarter for the last 6 quarters in a row. And that has all the evidence of a spiral.
Paul, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because we've got a call. Hi, do you have a question or a comment for Paul Gillin?
Well, yeah, we're talking about the newspaper business, and I understand why the business is going down because of advertising. The question is a bigger one about the future of democracy in America, whether the Internet or the bloggers, whatever you want to call it, can actually keep an eye on all the multitudes of local governments and police forces and such that newspapers have traditionally observed and informed about. What is there any future for just dirt-deep reporting and muckraking, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's a $64 question, and I think it's a very troubling one. Who is going to fulfill that role? Newspapers, because of the profitability that they enjoyed for many years, were able to support large teams of reporters who could essentially work without a business justification for what they were doing. It's one of the few industries in the world in which large numbers of people do work that has no direct impact on profitability or revenue, and that is going away. And who's going to fulfill that role? Now, I mentioned earlier the Politico and ProPublica and Talking Points memo and some of these emerging journalism models online that are having some success, but you're not going to replace 15,000 laid-off journalists with small operations like that, and I think it is a worrisome problem. We're already seeing that now. The coverage coming out of Iraq is down. We're seeing that Washington bureaus are being closed right and left. The public is already beginning to suffer the effects of the loss of all of these reporting resources, and I don't think it's clear yet what's going to step in.
I think. Go ahead, S.
It just seems there's a pattern of ignorance among the populace that the newspapers, I don't think we caused it. I say we as someone who worked for 22 years at one paper before getting laid off. But the point is that, we live in a world of American Idol and celebrity gossip, and I think it's the masses out there that really don't seem to care about what their government's doing anymore.
Well, I think that I largely agree with you. There is another point of view on that, though, which says that we are becoming the most open and transparent society on earth because we now have, there are 3 billion people now around the world that are carrying around cameras with them, capable of transmitting photos and even videos in real time. And those devices will become more and more powerful to the point that you will have, and we're seeing this, we see this every day in coverage of, for example, the Mumbai terrorist incident just a few weeks ago. For the first couple of hours was covered largely by people with camera phones and Twitter accounts. We are seeing a new force, if you will, of citizen journalists arrive, and we can debate the question of whether these people are journalists, but we are seeing a change in the way news is reported, where increasingly it will come from eyewitnesses on the scene. That doesn't address your point, which is a very valid one, about the digging into government records and keeping governments transparent. I don't think that citizen journalists are going to step in and do that. But there are other aspects of news coverage where we are seeing actually that work is simply being dispersed among people like you and me.
Well, I'll have to be doing it for free for a while, but yeah, I hope you're right. Thank you.
Thanks for calling in. I appreciate it. I think I know who that was, and that was very nice of him to call in. Do you think, as we go to a point where more people are coming online, and as you say, citizen journalists or eyewitness accounts, I think just the other day there was that plane that had trouble getting off the ground in Denver, and it started skidding at like 200 miles an hour. People were actually got on their Twitter accounts, and this is what you're referring to, and they were twittering. They were sending tweets immediately. Oh my God, the plane is doing this. The plane is doing that. And that was the first. A lot of people knew what had happened to the plane. Do you think we'll have this new generation of citizen journalists, if you will, or bloggers who will develop the credibility once reserved for newspaper journalists in terms of their reporting and their credibility?
Oh, I think it's already happened. I think that there are people out there reporting on their blogs about topics that we may not think of as being mainstream news topics, but they have tremendous credibility. I wrote a book called The New Influencers a couple of years ago, in which I interviewed quite a few of these people. One guy who's an expert on DVD rentals, but rentals by mail. Another guy who's an expert on hoaxes and patent remedies. Another two women who are experts on bringing up children. And these people are not journalists. None of them are journalists, but they have tremendous credibility in their chosen areas of expertise. I think that the definition of journalist is changing. The role, the reporter, the scoop reporter that we saw in the front page in the old Cary Grant movie, there will be fewer and fewer of those people. We will see more of the on-the-spot reporting will be done via people on the scene. So the Virginia Tech shootings this year were primarily covered by people with video cameras and cell phones in the initial hours. I think that worm is already turned. Major news events will in the future be reported first by citizens on the scene, and that changes the role of the journalist.
I'm curious to see this evening. I turned on the TV a couple hours ago, and I saw in Bethesda, Maryland, that a water main broke in the middle of this incredible cold spell, and there was they said there was a wall of 4 or 5 feet of water that was moving cars and trapping people in their cars, and the overhead, the helicopter video of these rescues and these boats on streets trying to get to people was incredible. And I just had this vision of someone sitting in their car, sending out a tweet or uploading something to their blog about I'm sitting in my car and I'm being washed away. Let me go. We've got another call here. Let's go. Hi, do you have a question or comment for Paul Gillin, the blogger behind newspaperdeathwatch.com? Hello? Nope, they hung up. Well, call back. We'll get you on as quickly as we can. Paul, let me give out the phone number one more time. If you've got a question for Paul Gillin, the man behind newspaperdeathwatch.com and author of the book The New Influencers, give us a call, 646-595-3135. I want to get specific with you about some companies, put you a little bit on the spot here. The Tribune Company recently declared bankruptcy. They, of course, are the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, Orlando Sentinel, the Star. Is it the Star Sentinel? The Sun Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale, and several Sun Sentinel. If there was a clock for how close the Tribune papers are to midnight, similar to the nuclear clock that the nuclear scientists have run, meaning that midnight would be death, where would you say the hands of the clock are set for the Tribune Company?
Well, the hands on the clock for the Tribune Company are at 11:59:59. I mean, they are in Chapter 11. It doesn't get much worse than that, except for liquidation. I think that the newspapers within the Tribune's portfolio will have good staying power. I mean, the Los Angeles Times is a venerable paper. The Chicago Tribune has is still very strong comparatively among its brethren. Orlando Sun Sentinel, the same thing. So I think that the titles will do pretty well for a while. The Tribune Company, though, it's flat on its back. It can't get any worse, because the only way companies emerge from bankruptcy can be a wonderful thing. Companies that are really that need to get their act together, that need to get rid of debt that's holding them down, that need to focus and just rejuvenate themselves, bankruptcy is a wonderful thing. And some great companies like Continental Airlines have actually emerged from bankruptcy. But bankruptcy in a declining industry, in a death spiral, is a terrible thing because the Tribune Company has $18 billion worth of debt. I mean, how do they pay that down? How do they get rid of that? There's no growth in the business. So what will happen with Tribune Company is, my prediction is they will not emerge from bankruptcy. They will be dismembered by the court, and they'll be sold off to private investors. Some of the papers in the portfolio, the smaller ones, will probably disappear as print editions and maybe reinvented online. But and the Chicago Cubs will be sold. They have a bunch of TV stations. Those will be cut up. But I can't imagine a company with that much debt and that dismal a future emerging from Chapter 11.
Okay, Paul, you have to really don't hold back. Tell us what you really think.
It was so sad too, because such a great company and really took itself down. Sam Zell took it down by leveraging it with all that debt, and then stuck the employees, the poor employees who were the shareholders of the company, stuck them with a lot of the debt. People at the Chicago Tribune are seeing most of their retirement savings evaporate as a result of the leverage buyout that Zell did. It's a tragedy.
Now, certainly, there's a lot of blame being thrown at Zell, and I don't want to defend him by any means. He does not seem like a man who was cut out for the newspaper business. But I have to ask, I mean, based on everything we've already talked about, I mean, do you really think Tribune Company would have survived the way it was going anyway? It probably wouldn't be too far from where it's at now anyhow.
Well, I mean, my prediction is that none of them are going to survive. So
right, that's what I mean. Yeah.
News Corp will survive. Murdoch's got the best of the business, and then probably and Gannett will survive, and Scripps will survive. So there are some companies I think that will come out of this. But no, Tribune Company was headed down, but at least it was being run by people who knew the newspaper business. When you look at the speed with which that company collapsed. I mean, Sam Zell he only took over the company in April of 2007. And at that point, he was giving very upbeat interviews about the bright future for this industry. Within 20 months, it's in Chapter 11. It was phenomenal how fast the company collapsed. So, it probably would have collapsed anyway, but it probably would have happened more slowly, and it would have been in the hands of people who were newspaper professionals. Sam Zell is a very bright man. He's a very capable man, and certainly a huge financial success in the real estate business, but not a newspaper guy. And you need, I'm not saying you need a newspaper person to be running these businesses now, but you need a media person. You need a person who understands publishing, and he does not.
Well, let's switch to another company. The New York Times is mortgaging its just completed Manhattan headquarters to pay some big credit facility bills coming due in 2009 and 10. Where is the New York Times on the death clock?
That's a real good question. There's a lot of mystery about the Times because the Times is still privately owned. It's a publicly traded company that is basically controlled by one family, and so there's a lot of mystery about the internal workings of that company and the financial situation. On the outside, it looks dire. I mean, the company looks like it's $1 billion in debt. It looks like it is on the verge of liquidity crisis. On the other hand, the Sulzberger family says everything's fine. We're going to be okay. We're going to ride this out, and there's no way to call them on that because there's money that they have access to that is not disclosed to the public. I think that the Times is vulnerable because the value of the Times company is under tremendous pressure right now, even outside of the New York Times newspaper, because so many of their other holdings are under pressure. For example, the Times paid $1.1 billion for the Boston Globe in, I think it was 5 years ago. I may have my timing wrong on that. A little bit longer than 5 years ago. The entire value of the Boston Globe now is estimated at around $120 million. That's the Boston Globe and the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. So about the entire value of that group is about 10% of what they paid less than 10 years ago to buy it. So when you see that kind of assets collapsing like that, it's hard to imagine how the company remains viable. And there's a lot of speculation now that the New York Times may, in fact, not be able to continue in print much longer. But I think it's too early to say, and not enough is really known. It's a paper certainly in deep trouble.
Well, can you set the hands on the clock for the New York Times?
Oh, geez. I mean, probably 11:56.
Wow. Okay.
Only because the Salzburgers have a lot of money.
Wow, just a couple of ticks behind Tribune Company.
I think what may happen there is that one of the crazy factors here, one of the unknown factors, is Rupert Murdoch, who, by all accounts, is the Wall Street Journal is the one newspaper that seems to be holding it together pretty well. And Murdoch might love to own the Times. Murdoch might want to buy the Times and merge it with the Journal, or run the two of them separately. He certainly he has the financial wherewithal to do it, and he's the one guy in the newspaper business who seems to be making money right now.
He seems to have a vision of how to apply that online media and make it work with everything else he has.
Well, he's diversified. I mean, Fox News, his company News Corp owns Fox News, and they own MySpace, which were two brilliant acquisitions, and have really insulated that company against its overexposure in the print market. Mm-hmm. And I think what he's doing with the Journal is working. He's trying to compete with the Times, and he's having success.
Yeah, he's actually getting some good reviews for it, which is kind of amazing, because I think a lot of people. Yeah, it's always a mistake, I guess, to bet against Murdoch when it comes to media properties. I mean, he just doesn't seem to make many bad moves.
He has brilliantly engineered the acquisition of Dow Jones. Has been brilliant, and he is just. You got to hand it to the guy. He's a media pro, but he's also visionary. In that years ago, when everybody else was sitting back on their fat profits out of the print business, he was diversifying into other media, and it's paid off for him.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to give out our phone number one more time here as we head into kind of the last segment of the show. If you've been sitting back listening and you have a question, or you want to comment or challenge us on something, give us a call at 646-595-3135. Of course, that only works if you're listening to us live. If you're listening to a recording of the show, well, Paul's back to watching and waiting for the next newspaper to drop, and I'm waiting to interview the next person about the newspaper dropping. Are small-town papers any better suited to survive in print than their big city cousins?
That's a good question. You hear a lot about that. There are lots of closures going on among weeklies now. In fact, there was a report just last week that Journal Register Company had closed something like a dozen Connecticut weekly papers all in one fell swoop, just shut them down all at once. And we're seeing that happen in the big Gannett layoffs that just happened a couple of weeks ago. There were several weekly papers were shut down. On the other hand, we are seeing some weeklies, or even some small-town dailies, have insulated themselves fairly well against the broader industry collapse, because they have very good local advertising sales. They have solid circulation. They're well entrenched in their community, and they seem to be somewhat insulated. So it really is a matter of there are spot successes. I think where we're seeing the biggest problems are the small papers that are owned by the big conglomerates, such as Gannett and Journal Register, are suffering because the parents are just saddled with so much debt. But the small independent weeklies and even dailies are actually, I wouldn't say thriving, but they're holding their own because they're not the victim of their parents' problems.
Curiously, I think it comes down to, are those community dailies, community weeklies, are they providing content that makes them stand apart? Can they provide information, reporting, or something that people aren't getting in the bigger papers that they can't get anywhere else? They can't get on TV. They can't yet get online, and it makes them stand out. Maybe it'll come down to content after all. And it
really does. And I just tell an anecdote. In my hometown, there was a newspaper, really kind of a rinky-dink little operation, you would have called it, a few years ago, with very, very localized not very professional, lots of typos and grammatical errors, and the writing wasn't all that good, but very, very local. The people who created the content were tied into the community. Now, a chain came in and bought this paper up, as well as many other papers in the area. And their thinking was, we're going to syndicate. We're going to take advantage of economies of scale. We're going to make these papers much bigger, and we're going to fill them full of articles from our wire service. And that's what they did. And the result was awful. It was just terrible. The paper went from being, 32 pages once a week to being 100 pages. It was full of all kinds of syndicated national advertising and newswire stuff that had no relevance to the community whatsoever, and it was a spectacular failure. It was called Community Newspapers, was the company that bought this. They're owned by the Boston Herald now, and largely considered a spectacular failure because it lost all of its personality. The advertisers couldn't be found anymore. You couldn't find them in a 100-page newspaper. The readers couldn't find information that was relevant to them because it was buried in all this wire service copy. So the idea that you would achieve economies of scale, which really fueled much of the newspaper industry consolidation of the late 90s and the early part of this decade, the idea that there was economies of scale in news proved to be a disaster. There is no economy of scale because news is so localized.
Well, as you were saying that, I was thinking in my introduction, I mentioned how at 13 I recognized that the New Brunswick Home News, which I think is now the Home News Tribune up there, was largely inadequate even for a 13-year-old to read. I knew I wasn't getting all the information I wanted. But I also remember that there was a weekly newspaper, and I'm trying to remember I think it was called the Sentinel at the time, and I think now it's the Packet. It's the part of the Princeton Packet newspapers. It's a weekly. There was stuff you would get in there that was never in the newspaper, and everyone that I knew relied on that weekly paper because there was neighborhood stuff in there. That was, the kid down the street reached Eagle Scout or whatever it was. That was the kind of stuff you could not get anywhere, and it made that paper stand out. And I think it's still publishing. I think it's called the Packet now, that's the kind of thing. You've got to have content that makes you stand out, and the people have to have you for something that they can't get somewhere else.
I'll say something controversial here, as if I haven't said anything else controversial. The worst thing that ever happened to American newspapers was Watergate. And Watergate is often considered to be the pinnacle of American journalism, and certainly drove many smart people into the journalism profession. But what Watergate did was create a culture of grandeur around journalism. It created the celebrity journalist, but it also created the idea that big news was, if news wasn't international or national in scope, it wasn't important. And so all of these newspapers invested money in Washington bureaus and foreign bureaus and setting up, going after the Pulitzer Prizes, nailing the big story, and they took their eye off the ball, and they forgot what you and I are talking about now, which is that local news is what people have always gone to newspapers for. That's the value that newspapers provide. They lost that perspective beginning in the 70s, and I think it spiraled out of control with things like the Jason Blair, fabricating stories for the New York Times, newspapers becoming almost drunk on their own influence and believing that they could do no wrong, really lost touch with their roots. And what we're seeing now in this whole spectacular destruction of this industry is there are new shoots are emerging. These smaller, very community-oriented operations are putting down roots and are finding that the heritage of newspapers as being part of the local community is what will make them viable in the future.
Mm. Yeah, one of the things I've been impressed. I'm in St. Petersburg, Florida. I think people get that from the introduction. And for years, I was concerned about the St. Petersburg Times, about whether it was going to be able to adapt. I think it's still a little slow on the web side. I think it could be a little more responsive and a little hipper on that side. But it's interesting. What they've been doing the last couple of years is taking their content product and branching out. They're using their expertise. They're still putting out print products, but they've been kind of interesting. They do a glossy monthly now called Bay that's aimed upscale. It's got tons of advertising. It's got advertising that it would never get in the print edition of the daily paper. The quality, it uses its photographers. It gives them the opportunity to take incredible photography, just great pictures, and puts them in this magazine. And then they started something completely different called Go Mama, which is a monthly aimed at parents, mostly women, of young children, and it's a separate print product that they actually send out in the mail. And that's been good. They also have, what you were talking about earlier, they do a daily free paper called TBT, which stands for Tampa Bay Times, and they distribute that. It's got a lot of advertising. It's made a lot of money for them. While they're still, I think, struggling with what to do with the daily paper and how to adjust the daily content to the web, and some of that they're still working out. I've been impressed that they've found other ways to use their content. I don't know that every paper is doing it. I have read that some of the Gannett papers have been doing that. They've had some success doing websites geared specifically to parents.
Yes, Gannett has some websites. One is for parents, and another one I think relates to music or nightlife. They're doing some online projects that are considered pretty hip and leading edge. And I think that you have to do that. I mean, online you have to be in constant launch mode. You have to constantly be starting new things and testing out new things. Online is a very forgiving medium. So that's the new way that you have to work. A newspaper, of course, is not accustomed to working like that, because to launch a publication in print takes months and a lot of money, whereas to launch something online may take weeks and not very much money at all. So we're seeing experimentation like that emerge. As there, out of catastrophe usually comes opportunity. The greatest change is usually enabled by disaster. So what we're seeing, if you look for a silver lining in all of this, the speed with which the print newspaper business is collapsing is creating a lot of innovation, because there's no choice. We've got to innovate. The only way we're going to survive is to do something really clever. And I think the rate of change, the rate at which the print newspapers will replace themselves with something that's more viable, will be faster, because the industry has gone through this tremendous disruption.
I have a question for you, Paul, from the web chat, the live web chat that accompanies all the live Mr. Media interviews. The question is this: do you have any suggestion for freelance writers who have relied on selling articles into small papers? Is there anything they can do? What would you recommend that they do to still have a market?
Well, you have to discard assumptions, and I think this is important to understand. One thing I learned in 25 years in the technology world is you need to discard assumptions. That's the only way you move forward. And so the assumption that freelance writing is going to be strictly for professional media operations, that's the only way you can do it, is a dangerous assumption. That's career limiting. I think that you look at, in the future, freelancers, I think that there will be lots of people who make a living freelancing. I think that they will write for a combination of corporate clients, media organizations, and themselves. I think that freelancers need to look at themselves as being the brand, not the publications that they write for. In the past, your identity was tied up very much in who published your work. What you see in the new generation of media stars, and I'm talking about people in their 20s now, is they have a web presence. They have a very strong web presence. They generally work in multiple media, video, audio, and online print, and their brand is really the center of their activities. So they may sell their services to a corporation in some cases, or they may sell it to a media organization, or they may simply write for their blog and make money on their blog. But it's all built around their brand. And I think Mike Arrington at TechCrunch is maybe kind of the ultimate personification of this idea, where the Mike Arrington brand is bigger than any of the media properties that he is involved with. I would also say we're moving into an age when anyone can be a publisher. People can be publishers. Any organization can be a publisher. Any corporation, any small business that wants to be a publisher these days has the means to do so. And some of them, most of them will do it horribly, but some of them will do it very well. And those organizations, I think, will become legitimate outlets for freelance writers who can actually make good money, essentially writing for businesses.
Paul, I want to give you a chance to tell us about, you've got a new book coming up called Secrets of Social Media Marketing. You want to tell us a little bit about what that's about before we have to wrap it up here?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, that's a new book came out about 2 months ago, Secrets of Social Media Marketing. It's a hands-on book. It's really about how to soup to nuts approach to how to create content for various social media channels, how to choose the right channels, how to choose a content strategy, and how to create it. And it's interesting in light of what we've been talking about here. I found when I was writing that book, I am not a marketer. I have no job history in marketing, but I found that my background as a publisher has been very relevant to the work I've been doing in the marketing field for the last 3 years, and that is precisely because of the phenomenon I was just describing, that all these businesses now are becoming publishers. And so there's a tremendous need now for marketers to understand the mechanics of packaging, of concept, of how do you get people, how do you do what the women's magazines have done in supermarket checkout aisles for 30 years? How do you do that online? And so the skills that professional publishers have actually have new meaning in the emerging world of corporate marketing. So that I found in writing that book that I was simply taking a lot of what I had learned in 25 years of publishing and spinning it for a different audience.
Well, I have one last question for you, and we'll let you go here. And you've been great. You've answered a lot of questions. It's just so sad that you just can't really let us know exactly what you think about things.
It's fun talking about this, believe me.
Paul, will it be a happy or a sad moment for you if newspapers do start dropping like leaves on a tree this year?
I think I'm over the grieving process. As I said, I really saw this happening about 3 years ago. And I wasn't the first by any means. There was actually a book published in 2005 that predicted that the last newspaper would be shut down, I think, in 2047. He was really optimistic.
Yeah, really.
So it's been. I certainly wasn't the visionary here, but I think I went through that grieving process some time ago. And at this point, I'm really eager to move on to the next thing because I think there's some very exciting stuff. I look at Wikipedia as being in many ways the future of journalism. If you look at how Wikipedia develops news and aggregates it and builds it over time, look at Wikipedia's coverage, and I would call it coverage. Take any recent event and take the Mumbai terrorist attacks and look at Wikipedia, the phenomenal content in there, all of it from aggregated news sources. So I think that there's some very, very exciting models that are beginning to emerge, and I think the faster we sort of clean out the deadwood of the print industry, the faster we move on to something new. I don't think it's a tragedy anymore. I think it's a cleaning process that unfortunately involves a lot of pain for a lot of people. My heart goes out to them. I feel terrible for all these veteran journalists who are losing their jobs right now. But there was no choice. This had to happen, and let's try to get through it as quickly as possible, move on to something better.
Well, folks, you can follow Paul Gillin's website, his blog, at www.newspaperdeathwatch.com. That's one solid word, newspaperdeathwatch.com. You can also order his books, The New Influencers and the upcoming Secrets of Social Media Marketing at great bookstores everywhere or online from Amazon.com or MrMedia.com. Paul, it's been a great hour. It's been fascinating to talk to you about this stuff, something I'm obviously very interested in, and we appreciate you joining us on Mr. Media today.
And thanks for so many great questions, Bob. You really it was a terrific interview. Thanks so much.
Which were the questions that sucked? Because I want to make sure I don't ask those again.
The questions that sucked. I can't think of a one that sucked. I mean, you asked about specific companies. You asked about local newspapers. They were really good questions.
That's the attitude. Okay, you're welcome back anytime, Paul. Anyway, thank you very much, and happy holidays.
You too.
All right, bye-bye. And folks, for dozens more newspaper-related interviews and much more, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com. That's mrmedia.com. That's where you can listen to my earlier conversations with Alberto Ibarguen of the Knight Foundation, Karen Dunlap of the Poynter Institute, Columbia University School of Journalism Dean of Students Sri Srinivasan, and former New York Times editor and reporter John Darnton, and many, many more. Please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, Digital Journal, Podcast Pickle, Vox, Folio, Mediafly, Podfeed.net, Blueberry, Zencast, Odeo, or iTunes. You can also listen with a piece of string and a tin can in many locations. If you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@andelman, ANDELMAN.com, or you can follow me and also contact me on Twitter. It's twitter.com/Andelman, ANDELMAN. Thanks so much for joining us today. As always, I appreciate when you give up a little piece of your day to spend it with us.